Clara Vance rewound the microcassette tape with a sharp click and pressed play for the third time. Through the tiny speaker, the police scanner recording crackled with heavy radio static. Dispatch's voice sounded muffled, calling for Unit 4 to check an automated relay alarm up at the Millers Creek silo at 3 in the morning. Then came Officer Hayes's response, his tone dropping from bored routine to tense confusion as he reported a sudden bank of fog near the culvert and a 12-degree plunge on his dashboard thermometer. "Dispatch, did you copy that sound?" Hayes had asked on the tape, his voice cutting through a wall of high-pitched feedback. Sounded like a radio fading between dead stations. Interference on the rig's ham radio, too. "Hold on. I'm at the silo gate. Doors wide open." Clara stopped the tape and took a sip of her coffee. She was sitting in a back booth at the Oakhaven Diner, the laminate table covered in topographical maps, local police blotters, and her own handwritten notes. At 27, Clara was the sole investigative reporter for the Obscura Observer, a low-budget weekly paper sold on wire racks across 3 counties. Most people in town dismissed the paper as a joke full of exaggerated ghost stories. But Clara wasn't interested in rumors. She cared about the folks whose strange experiences got swept under the rug. Across the booth sat Roy Jacobs, the 70-year-old night watchman for the grain silo. He was staring down into his mug, his hands wrapped tight around the warm ceramic, as if he were still trying to chase a chill from his fingers. Clara slid a small white bakery box across the table, opening the top to reveal 2 fresh apple fritters she'd picked up from Sarah's bakery earlier that morning. "Eat up, Roy," Clara said with a warm, encouraging smile. "Least I can do for bothering you so early." Roy looked at the pastry, a tired softness easing into his weathered face. "I told the sheriff already, Miss Vance. I'm not saying anything that's going to make people in town think I've been losing my mind on shift." "Off the record, Roy," Clara said gently, setting her recorder down and meeting his eyes with genuine empathy. "I know you're careful, and I know you take your job seriously." The sheriff logged it as a blown transformer. Was it a transformer? Roy let out a quiet, bitter laugh, rubbing his thumb against the edge of his mug. "Transformers don't make a room smell like a flooded cellar, Clara." I opened that control hut door, and the air hit my chest so hard I couldn't catch a breath. Like freezing your lungs on a 0-degree January night, except it's mid-October. "Did you see anyone out there?" Clara asked softly. "I thought I did," Roy muttered, looking toward the diner window. "Out by the tree line. My eyes play tricks on me in the dark, but it looked like a tall fella in a dark coat. Only his shadow was moving while he was standing dead still." He shook his head, rubbing his forehead with a calloused hand. The grain scale printer was going crazy, too, just spitting out blank rolls. When I grabbed the paper, my hands got covered in this black grease that took industrial soap to scrub off. And all 3 digital clocks in the office were stuck on 3:17 a.m., just flashing red. "Did he head toward town?" "Didn't walk anywhere," Roy said. I blinked, and the spot was empty. But whatever it was, it didn't come from town. It came up off the highway ditch. Clara reached across the table, gently placing a hand over his tired wrist. "Thank you for trusting me with this, Roy. Really, I know it isn't easy talking about stuff like this when everybody else wants to brush it under the rug." Roy gave her a small, grateful nod, taking a bite of the pastry. "You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm crazy, kid." After Roy finished his breakfast and headed home to get some sleep, Clara spent another hour organizing her notes. The hardest part of investigating the weird occurrences around Oakhaven was that nobody ever agreed on the details. Eyewitnesses were flawed. The gas company worker who inspected the silo at dawn swore a pack of stray animals had knocked over a battery housing. Mrs. Gable down at the bakery claimed her cousin heard a sound like tearing bedsheets coming from the power lines. Everyone saw a different piece of the puzzle, and half the town kept quiet out of fear of looking foolish. To make matters worse, the sheriff refused to release the security footage from the county road camera, claiming the file had been corrupted by a power surge. Clara pulled her county map toward her, tracing a red marker between the push pins she'd stuck into the paper. One pin sat at the grain silo. Another sat at the Route 42 diner, where the jukebox had run backwards 2 weeks ago. A third sat at County Road 8, where a row of streetlights had gone dark all at once. To the local authorities, these were isolated equipment failures. But when Clara drew a line connecting every single incident over the last 3 months, a distinct pattern emerged. They all trailed back down Highway 42 like a set of strange footprints. Yet right in the middle of that trail sat a 5-mile blank spot. A stretch of empty asphalt between Oak Haven and the open plains where no power failures or strange occurrences had ever been logged on a police blotter. Clara's finger traced along that empty line of highway, trailing out toward the rural dark. The pushpins simply stopped, leaving a quiet void on her map before the town border even began. Right near the center of that gap sat a tiny, lone label, the Oas-is gas station. She leaned back in the booth, staring thoughtfully at the paper. It was probably nothing, just the last brightly lit landmark out on the county line before the open road took over. But if whatever was happening in Oak Haven was truly coming off Highway 42, starting her questions at the outer edge of town made as much sense as anywhere else. Clara packed her recorder into her bag, made sure her waiter was taken care of, and pulled on her trench coat. She stepped out into the cool morning air, started her car, and pulled out on a Highway 42. Meanwhile, out at the Oas-is station, the clock behind the register read 3:45 a.m. The store was quiet. Chris stood behind the counter, a polishing rag in his hand, moving in clean, practice circles across the chrome coffee machine. Outside, the floodlights cast a harsh white glare over the concrete apron, cutting a solitary square against the vast Nebraska dark. His bad knee gave a small, familiar throb. He liked this time of night, the dead hour when even the semi-trucks grew scarce on Highway 42. Then, the automatic front doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The brass bells above the frame chimed crisp and clear. Chris didn't look up immediately, but his muscles instinctively coiled. His right hand casually drifted down toward the register drawer, stopping just 2 inches above the hidden compartment where his mag light rested. Footsteps clicked against the tile floor. They were measured, deliberate, and heavy, the sound of someone in a long coat walking straight toward the counter without stopping to look at the snacks or coffee. Chris finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the visitor. Standing on the other side of the counter was a woman in a dark wool coat. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Across her shoulder hung a heavy leather satchel that looked uncomfortably dense. She didn't look like a traveler, and she certainly didn't look like anyone from Oak Haven. "Store's open," Chris said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He kept his hand hovering near the drawer. "Coffee's hot. What can I get for you?" The woman stared at him for a long, quiet second. Then, a faint, dry smile touched the corners of her lips. "Still keeping your hand on the drawer, Chris?" she said softly. "Even after all these years?" Chris froze. The tension in his shoulders shifted from combat-ready to cautious surprise. "Elena, traffic on Highway 42 is terrible this time of night," Elena said, unslinging the heavy leather satchel from her shoulder and setting it down on the glass counter with a dull, metallic thud. "And finding parts that actually hold up out here isn't easy." Chris let out a low breath, pulling his hand away from the drawer. "I wasn't sure you'd bring it yourself. I wanted to make sure it was right," Elena replied, unzipping the satchel. She was an old colleague from his medical student days at Gray Hollow, one of the few who had also witnessed the nightmare in room 302 and chosen to work behind the scenes supplying countermeasures. She reached into the satchel and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined wooden box, opening the lid to reveal a newly machined brass housing ring etched with intricate heat dispersal grooves, alongside a pair of thick, polished obsidian lenses. "You asked for something stronger," Elena said, her voice dropping as she looked around the quiet store. "This ring will keep the metal from burning your hands when the light gets too hot. The cold out on this road is getting worse, Chris. It feels heavier than it used to." Chris reached out, his calloused fingers carefully feeling the cold, heavy brass. It feels solid. Good weight. It'll hold up when you hit them, Elena nodded. Just make sure the lens sits flush before you turn it on, or the glare will... Before she could finish her sentence, the overhead fluorescent lights in aisle 2 violently flickered and died. A sudden, violent pressure drop slammed through the store. Both of their ears popped at once. In less than 2 seconds, the room's temperature plummeted 15 degrees, turning their breath into thick white plumes in the air. On the snack racks, every single bag of potato chips began to crinkle and pop in unison as a wet, low-frequency vibration rattled the floorboards under their boots. "Spill," Chris barked, slamming the velvet box shut and shoving it under the counter. He yanked the register drawer open, gripping the heavy handle of his mag light and clicking the switch. From beneath the soda fountain, a thick, ink-like shadow surged outwards, pooling rapidly across the linoleum like spilled oil moving uphill. The ambient light in the store warped toward it, dimming the remaining ceiling tubes to a sickly amber hue. Elena didn't hesitate. She reached into her wool coat, pulled out a compact brass device, and slammed it onto the counter. "It's going for the main power line. Keep it away from the wall." Chris stepped out from behind the counter, his boots planting firmly on the tile. He raised the mag light, the obsidian lens refracting a blinding beam of violet heat directly into the center of the dark mass. The entity hissed violently, oily smoke curling upward as the light burned through the creeping shadow. The smell of wet ash and cold iron filled the air. The floorboards groaned under the heat as Chris advanced step by step, forcing the dark surge back toward the corner until it dissolved into a harmless, dry soot. The fluorescent lights flickered twice and snapped back to brilliant white. The temperature slowly began to rise. Chris stood in aisle 3, his chest heaving slightly, the violet beam cutting through the settling smoke. "That hit hard," Elena breathed, adjusting her coat as she picked up her device from the counter. "They're pushing harder. They're getting bolder," Chris muttered, clicking off the light and wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "That was just testing the lock." "Well," Elena sighed, zipping her satchel back up. "At least we got the new parts delivered before things got really ugly. Let's hope nothing else comes down the road tonight." Right on cue, the automatic front doors slid open with a cheery ding-ding. Chris and Elena both snapped their heads toward the entrance, Chris's thumb instantly hovering back over the maglite switch. Standing in the doorway was a young woman in a trench coat damp with highway mist, a leather-bound notebook tucked under her arm, and a heavy camera slung over her shoulder. She stopped dead in her tracks, her sharp eyes instantly taking in the entire scene. The drifting wisps of oily smoke in aisle 3, the heavy brass flashlight held ready in Chris's hand, and Elena standing near the counter beside an open satchel. For a long, frozen second, nobody moved. The newcomer slowly raised an eyebrow, her gaze lingering on the brass flashlight before shifting up to meet Chris's eyes.